resources. I'm really eager to get into this particular session. I myself was trained back in the 90s in freshwater ecology and toxicology. Used to spend a lot of time thinking about water, but sort of light switch went on for me in my studies when I took a class in environmental policy. We learned about the tri-state water wars between Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And for me, it sort of demonstrated that science is not enough, right? Science is important, but really how science factors into our broader governance of water and natural resources is both fascinating and challenging at the same time. And we're going to dig into some of those issues this afternoon, not just thinking about the Southeast US context, but thinking internationally. So glad you're here. So to get this conversation going, I'm joined by three esteemed panelists that I'm really eager to hear from. So furthest away from me, we have Bunyod Hollmatov, who is a water, food, energy nexus research group leader at the International Water Management Institute. In the middle, we have Rosario Sanchez, who is a senior research scientist for the Texas Water Resources Institute and associate graduate faculty of the Water Management and Hydrological Sciences program at Texas A&M University. And just here to my left, we have Aaron Wolf, professor of geography at Oregon State University, who also has an appointment as a professor of water diplomacy at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education, a place I actually visited myself a few years ago. So by this point in the day, I think you know the drill. So we're going to start off with sort of a moderated Q&A among myself and the panelists. And then we're going to transition to taking your questions from the microphones, either here in the room or virtually, depending upon your geography and your preference. So to dive into this conversation, I want to hear from each of our panelists. I want them to sort of provide their own kind of perspective or entry point into this particular issue of transboundary water management, particularly in a changing climate. So Aaron, I'm going to start with you first. Can you help us sort of problematize this issue? Like, what are the big current challenges in transboundary water management, and maybe a little bit of how climate change factors in?
Yeah, sure, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Academies and those who've set this up. I think that just to start us off, picking up where Ben did, the problem of water is really, really complicated. On the one hand, we all want to approach it like a technical problem. And so I got my start in the University of Wisconsin. I was working for a federal agency there that I won't name, but that surveys geology. And there was a plume of pesticides that was moving from a cranberry bog to a municipal well close by. And we were hired to answer the question that was on the municipality's mind, which was, when does the plume hit us, right? Well, so we went and did all the science we could, and we calculated, and we cored, and we modeled, and we did all the things that scientists did, and found out that that plume would hit the well somewhere between 5 years from now and 50,000 years from now. With really high certainty, I should say. So that was kind of the moment where I recognized that this disconnect between what science can offer and what questions need answering in the human sphere is vast. And we really need as much training in how human processes work. How do we listen better to each other? How do we problem solve together? And so this got me into this world of kind of water conflict management and transformation. And through that, a real understanding that there are four waters, if you will. There's, in the frameworks that I work with, you have physical water, the water that we touch, the water that we move, the water that we carry. We have mental water, where we calculate efficiencies, crop per drop. But we also have emotional water, water tied to history, to sovereignty, to power. And finally, we have spiritual water. Just quick show of hands, how many people here come from a faith tradition that uses water for spiritual transformation? Yeah, everybody does. Even those of you who are too scared to, I know, it's like my freshman class. Like, it's okay to raise your hand. Everybody does. The point is, in the West, we deal with the technical water really, really well, and we try and leave all that other stuff at the door. And in conflicts, we're trying to solve technical problems where the actual conflict may well be about history, sovereignty, power, or spirituality, or all of those together. So we in the West are walking around with one eye shut, that we shut during the Enlightenment, trying to understand this really complicated set of problems without all of our facilities. Now put international boundaries there. Now you've got 313 basins that cross international boundaries, 60% of drinking water, half the land surface of the earth, and a lot of the people that share basins don't like each other very much. So in the 1990s, a lot of people pointed and thought very simplistically, oh, look, Arabs and Israelis share water, Indians and Pakistanis share water, Azeris and Armenians share water. We're all running out, climate change is coming, they're all going to war. And that was kind of the prevailing wisdom for a number of years, until a lot of people who had training on both the human side and the physical side pushed back and said, wait a second, you've forgotten the institutions that we craft to deal precisely with the problems that we're facing. If you have really good institutions that can deal with variability, that can manage conflict, that can help people have better dialogue, you're not going to blow up in the kinds of ways that you're thinking. And so that dialogue between the water conflict scenario and the water cooperation scenario has been playing out since the 1990s. And I think that's where we are. The last point about climate change, again, in our model, you have two things going on. You have what's happening in the physical watershed, and you have the institutional capacity to deal with that, and both of those are changing. So climate change is bringing us more variability, sometimes more than the treaty or river basin organization can handle, or it's shifting from snow to water, or there's more energy needs because of AI or Bitcoin or whatever else. So those are the things that are shifting, but we also have a rich, rich history now going back 4,500 years in negotiations and in treaty making and river basin organizations that I'm convinced we can draw on to help us make it through these coming changes.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. So, Zoe, I want to turn to you. You work specifically on groundwater. I'm based in Southern California, so we hear about water and groundwater constantly. It's a constant refrain, but I think many of us take it for granted. So what does this look like from your perspective, and particularly what's different maybe about transboundary issues related to groundwater versus surface water?
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I guess if what Aaron was discussing seems difficult, groundwater is truly difficult. Despite the fact that you have to try, because you don't see it. So everything, when we talk about surface water and all the challenges that we have to face, just think about that when you actually do not see it. And when you actually share it. Currently, over the 400 or so transboundary aquifers recognized, depends on the definition, right, that we use, because you have to negotiate that too. If we think about a definition of an aquifer here domestically, well, you just go to USGS and you just follow a very standard definition. But when you have an aquifer that is shared between one or two countries, you have to negotiate that too. What is groundwater, right? What are the limits of that system? How do you measure it? How do you know? How can I trust you? And everything, the emotional, the spiritual, the history, everything comes into play. So at the end of the day, you do not negotiate water, you negotiate something else. Either, complexes, either history, other needs, other priorities even. So it becomes even more complicated and more challenging, because as compared to surface water, we have less data when it comes to groundwater, especially transboundary aquifers. And if we think about just locally, locally for me, I'm in Texas. Now I'm in the north.
Not in the north.
Southern, or even in the northern part too as well. It's very, very limited data you can play with. Very, very limited elements that you can use for negotiation purposes. So everything is kind of out in the blind, and it becomes much, much more challenging. And if we think about negotiation processes, and you don't have enough data, so, I learned this from you. What's the minimum amount of data that you have to get to make a decision? So we as scientists always think that we need more data. We need more data. Especially when it comes to groundwater and physics of the system is very complex. And you will never have that certainty necessary to make decisions, not a transboundary detail. So what is the minimum amount of data you can deal with? And then you have to convince, right, the other stakeholders from the other side. So I will leave it with that, just to make you aware that there's a whole new world. And that whole new world, it's linked with the surface water. So we need to recognize that they're different. They're part of the same family. It's like husband and wife relationship. They're not the same. The family doesn't work if they don't work each other. We're going to work each other. I will leave it with that knowledge.
Great, thanks, Rosario. And yeah, I think you raised the really important topic of data. We're going to circle back on that a little bit later, because I think that issue of what's the minimum amount of information we actually need to make decisions, I think is going to be key. Okay, so last thing I want to turn to you, Bunyod. And, obviously we're concerned about water, but one of the reasons why we're concerned about water is because of what water does for us, the service it provides in terms of things like food, in terms of energy. You work at the sort of nexus of the food, water, energy, yeah, that nexus. So tell us a little bit more about that nexus, why it's important, and what is the relationship between the interaction between these three different systems and transboundary water management.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Ben. So I also want to thank the organizers of the event. It's great to be here. So with regards to the nexus, to start with the basics, nexus is just a word. It means linkages, right? And it's been used in different fields from last century. So anything from medicine to finance. But why it became so important in the field of environmental science is from the famous 2011 Bonn conference, the water, energy, food, security nexus solutions to the green economy. There it was promoted as an approach where if we capture the synergies between these different interlinked sectors, then we can reap more benefits than if we pursue solutions in silos. So that was the whole idea of why Nexus became important in the field of environmental science. And actually, all these three sectors, water, energy, and food, they're very important for the climate change, because most of the climate change impacts will be felt through water, while energy is the largest contributor to climate change. And food also the same way. It's at risk from climate change, but it also contributes, like the rice fields, they emit methane, and we use a lot of our input in our food systems, which again contribute to climate change. So impact of climate change on WEF nexus can also, when we link it with transboundary water management, it can complicate it, but it also makes the whole negotiations more important. I come from Central Asia, which basically refers to 5 former Soviet republics: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. And there we can see nexus and transboundary issues very much interlinked. Because during the Soviet times, they're just known for the legacy of building large infrastructure. They have one of the world's tallest dams. They have one of the longest canals. And they did that because the upstream countries in Central Asia, they do not have as much endowment in fossil fuels. So they depend on generating their power from hydropower. While the downstream countries, we are endowed with fossil fuels, but we need water for irrigation. But the timing of releases during the Soviet times, it was negotiated by the Moscow. So these multi-purpose dams, where the downstream countries supplied energy in return for releasing water during the vegetation period. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole dynamics changed. Now the upstream countries want to release water during cold months when the downstream countries don't need water, right? So that's where we can see the WEF nexus complications very much. And I work for IVMI, which is a research for development organization, and we have a number of projects in the region which focuses on the nexus, like specific nexus and transboundary issues. One of them is called Nexus Gains. It's a CGIAR initiative, and there we have a number of work packages, but one of them, for example, in work package 1, we're looking at the foresight methodologies. So for example, with the climate change, there is changes in water supply, and also there's increasing demand, right? But what the countries want to do is increase their storage capacity. But what does it do to the shared water resources, like if you build our multipurpose dams? So before we invest that, we want to capture that in the models to see how it will basically affect the distribution of water availability at different nodes of the system. So that's, for example, one of the activities that we're doing. And another one, we're using remote sensing techniques, the new techniques to actually map alternative water storage. Because in Central Asia, it's whenever we're talking about storage, we're talking about gray infrastructure. But there are also options to use alternative water storage options, be it groundwater, for example, or soil moisture. So mapping those alternatives and then giving those to the decision makers to say, hey, maybe you don't need to build gray infrastructure. Maybe you can utilize some of the existing alternative water storage options. So I guess I will stop at that. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you. So, okay, so I think by this point you have to have a feel for what our panelists are passionate about and where their expertise lies. This is, however, Climate Crossroads. I want to dig in a little bit more on the climate piece of this. I want to turn back to you, Rosario. You know, we hear a lot lately about climate change, drought, aridity in the U.S. Southwest. We've also heard a lot about it in places like Mexico and Mexico City, which has been struggling with water availability, at least reportedly. So can you sort of talk about that particular context? How does climate change impact groundwater? And particularly, how does that complicating some of the relationships between, say, U.S. and Mexico in terms of water resource use?
Well, we tend to think that groundwater is much more resilient to climate change, but since we think that is actually working against us, because it's everybody's turning into groundwater now because it's much more resilient to increasing temperature. So our pumping has been increasing, especially on the southern part, southwest, and we can see that very easily. On the border between Mexico and the U.S., around, usually the traditional number is between 7 to 8 million people, depends solely on transboundary groundwater resources. But when there's drought, that number easily increases to 10 million people. Because we cannot rely on surface water anymore. Actually, our international dams are below 20%, and it seems like this for over the year, causing a lot of issues between Mexico and the U.S. So yes, groundwater is much more resilient in its natural state, but since we don't have enough surface water for current growth, this is my fault. I'm sorry. No, it's me.
Oh.
I told you something was gonna happen. I'm sorry. Let's start all over again. Did you guys hear it? No? Well, it doesn't care. Okay. You got the fun part. Okay. So the reliance on groundwater is increasing. So that resiliency effect that we think we have in groundwater is just working against us, is putting groundwater at risk because we don't know much about groundwater. So we're relying on, on a credit card that we don't know the interest rate or something like that, or savings account. We're using savings account right now without knowing how much money we actually have to be spending. In terms of, and apart from that, we don't have a regulatory system that regulates groundwater in the border. Or worldwide, we have, I believe, 7 or 8 transboundary groundwater agreements, and not necessarily of them deal with management, but just sharing data, because that's a big thing, to share data. And the rest is just, we rely on that without managing at transboundary scale. And this is true for US Mexico, it's true for US Canada, it's true for most of the world. So knowing this, the challenges are just adding up to that list of layers that I explained before. And it becomes more visible. The challenges are becoming much more visible. In the case of the drought that it's hitting not just Mexico City, I think the drought is everywhere. But yes, Mexico is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. I honestly don't know why, but I've seen what's going on in there, and Mexico City is one of the largest countries in the world that it's increasingly relying more on groundwater with subsidence issues. The 0-day is expected to be in 15 or so years. And the city, it's still operating as usual, as nothing is actually happening. I guess when you have too many issues, too many priorities, too many challenges at the same time, you just lose sight of each one of them. And that's the way the city is operating. The big Cutzamala system that brings water to the city for over 300 kilometers against gravity, actually, it's pumped water from outside of the basin, loses the same amount of water that actually gets into the system. So it's a surreal case from my perspective that, I don't know, we still need to figure out what's going on. But yes, with the new president now in place, a lot of expectation has come in terms of water and the water agenda. Not sure what actually the federal government will be able to do, because this has gone beyond federal government. We need to do more at a local scale, especially when it comes to groundwater. Groundwater is very, very local as compared to surface water. It's very attached to communities. It's very attached to history. So the local approaches need to really be worked out in a way that it's understandable, in a way that people and stakeholders are part of the solutions and they become aware of what's going on. Again, how do they become aware if we don't have enough data, right? And we don't have enough transparency also of that information. It's a taboo. So you name it.
Thanks, Rosario. And as you mentioned, it's not just in Mexico where we're seeing these kinds of problems pop up again and again and again with increasing frequency, both in terms of individual municipalities, but also broader regional areas. So Aaron, this is all fascinating, right? Scientifically, socially, economically, we as researchers find this stuff cool to study, but it has real impacts on people and people's lives and people's livelihoods and communities. So what does the solution look like? How do we get different actors, whether it's nation states or districts, to work together to try and get out in front of these, so we're not just ignoring the problems that we can see down on the horizon, we're actually dealing with them in the present day?
A great question. I think one of the interesting things about water is precisely the things that we think might bring us towards conflict also induce dialogue. So if we think about a drought, for example, or a series of droughts, or a plume of pollution, all of these things you would think, oh my gosh, they hate each other and it's crossing borders, this is going to bring conflict. But what it does, if we look actually, it forces people's attention, it brings resources, it brings people to the table, sometimes in secret, if they don't have relations, to a point where they'll try to have these discussions. And I think that's maybe one of the key messages, is better conversations earlier is profoundly important. I think what both you and Rosario mentioned is that there's a difference between water scarcity or water insecurity leading to horrible death and destruction, which it does. There's no question. Millions of people die because they don't have access to it. It brings disease, environmental degradation. All of this is happening. And a separate question is around harder security issues, conflict, cooperation. And sometimes we end up conflating this. Like, look, people are dying. Yes, they're dying. Is the incentive then to go across the border and attack the neighbor? And so it's that second part that I think doesn't happen very often. It's embarrassing talking about it. Aaron Salzberg, who's sitting here, was the point person for international water in the State Department for decades, and has been in a lot of those rooms. So I hope he doesn't say anything to contradict me. But I think this is the important point. Water, whether we're talking internationally, it brings people in a room who won't sit in the room together and gives them something really important to talk about. And at the subnational level, I work all over the West, little bitty basins that nobody's ever heard of, where you've got environmentalists, you've got ranchers, you've got city people willing to talk together, because we recognize that with this resource, different than any other resource, the only way to work through our crises is through better dialogue, through better management, through more creative problem solving. And again, the record is there. If you look at the Jordan Basin, for example, they ran out of water in 1968. I mean, demand hit supply in 1968. This is Arabs and Israelis, not a very Pacific place to be. And everything that's happened in all of those years, all the economies growing, the demographics growing, the immigration from Russia, from the Gulf, everything that happened through greater efficiencies, greater problem solving, greater dialogue when it was possible. So I think it has the potential to bring people in the room, and what we want to do is make sure, as you pointed out, that that folks are coming in who historically haven't had the opportunity to be in that room.
Okay, so this is another example of not letting a crisis go to waste, right? Okay. I want to follow up on that, because essentially what you're talking about is environmental diplomacy, right, to some extent. There's a sort of argument or narrative that, you know, actors that have trouble having conversation around other topics might be able to come together and find common cause around some of our environmental challenges. Do you see that playing out in the real world?
I think in the water world, for sure. And I'm only a water guy. I don't know anything about anything else. I don't even know a lot about salt water. So I know this is true in the water world, because I've sat in the room with the people who don't have agreements. I've been in a room where one country, they don't recognize the other country, but they recognize that they have to be able to, the scientists have to be able to work with each other to identify pollution hotspots. And so they've sent secret delegations and sat in the basement of some international chain in the Capitol, hoping against hope that word of these people being there would not get out, because they'd be in physical danger. So I know this happens, and I know it happens a lot. And again, Aaron could probably tell a lot more stories about it happening. And I want to come back. I mean, not to let a crisis go to waste. I think what we're trying to learn how to do is have the crisis mentality well in advance of the crisis, right? If we see the cliff, 100 miles away, now's the time to start working on it, right? Not waiting until all these things are going to bring the attention.
Okay, great. So if part of the solution is getting people in the room, knowledge sharing, building networks, Bunyod, I think you have a specific example of this. So you were part of the peer-to-peer network that is established as part of the National Academies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's being used to help build relationships and networks in transboundary water management?
Sure. So peer-to-peer is basically something that enables trust and building, and then also exchanging best practices. So we are part of the peer-to-peer, and it's actually an AxelNet Award by the U.S. National Science Foundation to the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, University of California, Irvine, and Oklahoma State University. It's also co-financed by the USAID, and there the vision is basically to establish a global network of regional water networks to basically promote exchange, integration, discovery among US researchers and also counterparts from Central Asia, Middle East, and North Africa. And the current and former grantees are the part of the network who were part of the peer project financed by the USAID. And I have to say, IVME was part of that peer project in the past. And one of the activities that we've done is, so in Uzbekistan, about 20% of the produced electricity goes into water supply, basically, to convey water. So, and the global average is about 5%. So that's way higher than the global average. And that's because almost every second hectare of irrigated land uses water that's been lifted. And in certain places, we have installations where cascade of pumps lift water 100 to 150 meters to irrigate land. So that's very inefficient use of energy, right? And that's where we can also see the nexus between water, food, and energy. So when we were part of that project, what we've done is actually been able to show that you can reduce water that's being lifted because now you're applying excess water to irrigate fields. So if we apply water-saving technologies, that would translate into reducing energy that's used to pump water, while we're not going to lose any reduction in the crop yields. So when we, and plus, because the energy is produced using fossil fuels, we're also contributing to climate mitigation. So when we presented that research, the government of Uzbekistan reacted by basically supporting farmers who invest in water-saving technologies by subsidizing those technologies. So they returned between 40 to 50% of the costs. So that was a huge success, and that's like the type of knowledge that now we're sharing in peer-to-peer. And this is the third year of the program. And this year, we're basically focusing on lessons from managing transboundary water resource vulnerabilities. And if anyone is interested, the peer-to-peer will be holding a session at the AGU. So you're welcome to submit an abstract because we're going to have a session on transboundary water management. So many of the people in this room will probably be interested in that. So yeah, that's how we're using peer-to-peer.
Great, thanks for that. Specific examples of how we're tackling these issues sort of in place and at scale, but also the knowledge sharing piece, right? So once we've learned about something that works, how do we disseminate that information out so others can benefit from it? All right, I want to circle back. I said I was going to circle back on the data question, so I'm going to circle back on the data question. This seems to be, particularly, I want to try and reflect upon this morning session around AI, right? So everybody, as researchers, we're always data hungry. We want to have more information for our modeling to draw conclusions. Decision makers always want to have data to justify their particular decisions. I always look at sort of the water arena as a place that's very data rich because of the importance of water, but at the same time, it's very data poor. To resort to your point, if we can't see it, it's very hard to measure it. So I'm going to throw this open to all three of you because I think all three of you sounds like you have an experience in this space. But given the importance and the value that we place on water, I want to circle back to this issue of sort of what's minimum amount of data that's needed. So what data do we need? What data would like to have? What can we do more of if we had more data, or is it sufficient?
I have no idea.
I'm with her.
Good. I put it on now. I have no idea. I mean, it all depends on who you're talking to, who you want to talk to, and sometimes even when you have the data or some data, the message is not being delivered correctly. I mean, there's a lot of, I guess we have a mission as a scientist that apart from producing data and generate knowledge and science, I think we're missing the last step, how to communicate that science into, the sectors, the communities that we are supposed to be impacting by this knowledge. I believe we have missed that step. And that's very true when it comes to transboundary waters or transboundary aquifers, which is very technical. I mean, aquifer research is very, very technical. And then you try to communicate this, whatever data, available data you have to stakeholders that have never, ever read about this. So it's like the translation of that science into something that is actually usable, practical, and understandable to a lay audience. I think that's the best way that I can describe, because we as scientists, we need more data, but the people that actually makes decisions, they don't need more data. They want answers, and they want to understand the problem, and sometimes we miss that link. Like, what do you want to know? So sometimes, we go to those meetings and we present our big maps, and these are the transboundary, and then they say, so what? What do you want me to do with that? And they are right. I mean, what do we want them to do with that? So what is the overall objective of producing this science, with what purpose, and who are going to actually have, affect and have an impact at the end of the day with that science? So I think that's the question that we need to answer ourselves, because there's no way we're never gonna get enough data. But if we are able to figure out what the question is that people are trying to answer, I think it's easier for us to accommodate or available data or request or field work or everything that we need to do on the back end, I guess, to give that answer with a modest level of certainty.
Data for data's sake is probably not very helpful without understanding the specific context of what people need, which I think, if we learn anything from the whole dialogue around co-production of knowledge, that's the starting point is for what are you trying to do? What are your objectives?
And I'm going to give you a quick example because I want you guys to say on this. But originally, we thought that we actually needed an agreement between U.S. and Mexico on transboundary aquifers. We thought, and I assumed that. We assumed that, right? We should have an agreement. And then we go out there and we do actually a field work and figure out what the stakeholders would actually need or want. And the answer was the opposite. No, we don't want a transboundary water agreement. We want a local scale approach arrangements, which are not necessarily binding, that are much more efficient. And they respond to our special, particular needs of the region. So that, for me, was shocking. It was kind of, oh my God, I mean, we are assuming that people need this, and what they actually want and need, and makes a total sense, is this. So I learned that the hard way, by the way.
Aaron, Bunyod, anything?
Yeah, no, I love this example, and I like the way you couch the question, and it probably needs another clause, because it said, how much data do we need? And so what Rosario's asking is, for what? To totally understand the system, we'll be here forever, right? And I have friends I'm in the climate side of OSU, and they think if only they get the right amount of data, suddenly everybody will believe them. And it's not going to happen. No matter how much data they get in their climate change model, and how many significant figures, there's going to be a population that simply is not going to believe them. It has nothing to do with the data. So if the for what is to come to an agreement on next steps, it turns out that the amount of data you need is actually not very much. And what you do then is develop, as you mentioned, a joint process to collectively, collaboratively start to work to understand the system better. And that in and of itself, you don't end up with competing models. People are willing to, even if it's not as good science, at least it's their science, and they can work with that. So I'll give another example because you mentioned the tri-state, the ACT and the ACF, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. My first academic job was the University of Alabama, Roll Tide, anybody here know? So in the middle of this, right, 90 inches of rain, and they still find stuff to fight over. And one of the questions was, you know, Georgia is sucking up all the water in the headwaters, and they need fishing and environmental protection down in the delta. And they're arguing, they're negotiating. At one point, they just turned to the biologists who were responsible for the delta. It's like, how much water do you need and when? Tell us now. It's like, oh my God, no, we need to do a 10-year baseline study, and then maybe the baseline has changed, and we have to check our this, and we have to check our that. For a scientist, tell us now is a frightening proposition. They said, that's great, you have a month. So what they do, they got 10 experts, people who've been working in the Delta their entire lives, and they said to the 10 experts, draw us a hydrograph based on your gut. And not literally, but based on their understanding of the system. And all 10 of them did it. 9 of them were identical. And the one that didn't, they said, oh, why not? And they thought about the assumptions going in and what actually happens with precipitation. He changed his. All 10 of them, from their instinct, were able to come up with a hydrograph. So the point is that our data may come from lots of sources that don't include kind of the latest measurement. It can come from indigenous knowledge. It can come from local use, people who've been, you know, 8th generation farmers know an awful lot about their stream that may not be captured. And finally, I think we're getting a lot more with AI, with satellites. We can tell streams and reservoirs, but we'll never know if we can tell what a reservoir is doing now. We'll never know when they will and won't turn the floodgates on, right? And so we still need to figure out better trust, more collaboration, and working together even as we find out more information.
Great. Bunyod, anything on data?
Yeah, so I totally agree. I think everything was already said. You know, it like depends on why. Like, you know, when is it enough? It's like, what do you want to do? So just to also give an example, again, coming from the water, energy, food nexus perspective, right? Like, if it's so difficult to get just data for water sector itself, imagine when we have to capture also data for food and energy system, because then we're talking about different scales, different actors, different units, different institutions, right? So the whole complexity just becomes, whoa, you know, something very difficult to manage. But still, there are some models that we can use to capture the complexity. But the thing is, the data, it may exist, but it's not necessarily accessible or not in the right format that the models need. So then what it becomes, it's very important, like what was already said, partnerships. You know, you need to work with the end users. Who is going to use like whatever the outputs from those models, right? And for what? And one of the things they ask is, can you show me results? Like what can it do? But you know, with these new modeling techniques, with the new AI-induced models, sometimes they're like capturing complexity means that, you know, it's not easy, and then you need a lot of data input. And if the quality of the data is not good, then garbage in, garbage out. Or if you don't have enough data. So then, you know, what we're trying to do is simplify these systems just so we show the results on a smaller scale. So scale becomes very important because the larger scale means more data. So we can zoom in, use the data that we know or have at a smaller scale, do that modeling, show the results to the stakeholders. And once we have their buy-in, then we can go at the larger scale, because then they will be interested in supplying that data because they know what they will get in return for investing that type of data.
Great. Yeah, well, my story about the tri-state water war, what I learned back in the 90s is sort of to stay out of the courts. The courts sent the states away and said, go collaborate, do modeling on all of your basins, figure out an allocation scheme that works for everybody. And so they all agreed and went away and did the modeling. And not surprisingly, the modeling did not reveal a solution that made everybody happy. And so they went, no. You reject the modeling and just, back into the courts. So Sometimes all the data and technology in the world doesn't necessarily solve your policy issue. Okay, I'm going to do one more. Before I do that, I want to prompt all of you who have been waiting quite patiently. If you've got questions of yourselves, now's the time to jot that down, formulate your question, head over to the microphone. If you're listening in virtually or online, get your question queued up in Slido. If you're quick, you might be the first question we ask, because we're going to start with a Slido of questions. Okay. So that's your cue to get started. Last question for me for this group. I want to circle back on the sort of local scale nature of this. So Bunyod, you were talking about sort of this small scale effort. So we've been talking a lot about sort of national disputes and, across the, U.S.-Mexico border. What about local communities? So how do we ensure that the sort of concerns, preferences, needs of local communities are being addressed in these sort of broader interstate geopolitical transboundary disputes? I'm certainly not asking myself, because I don't know. So I'm asking any one of you that feels like you have something to say on this.
Sure. So let me give one of the examples. So, with Oregon State, we're now part of this project that is funded by the State Department. IUCN is also part, Shared Water Resources. So there we're looking at how can we basically improve cooperation in some of the river basins where the cooperation is not doing well, right? So one of the things we chose was a small tributary which is shared between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan in Central Asia. And we realized that, it's so difficult to initiate cooperation in these rivers because a lot of times it's political, it's like at a higher level. But then the practitioners, people who are really working with the water resources are at the very local scale. And they have a lot of needs and wishes which we think can really benefit if taken up, right? So what we tried to do is assess, okay, can we then go into any kind of river basin and try to understand the real barriers for cooperation in those river basins? And we developed a rapid assessment process where we took 10 indicators, which is like, does the agreement exist, for example, right? Is there data exchange, for example? And we did triangulation of results. So we first reviewed literature. What does literature say about answers to those indicators? And once we did that, we went and we talked to the local stakeholders, and that benefited so much. We interviewed practitioners, and then after that, we brought both sides together in a workshop. And there we invited also people from the ministries, from the higher level. And this was an amazing moment when all these people from different levels could jointly then develop some of the recommendations based on the barriers that were identified through this RAP process. So that was like one of the, for example, ways we realized that we can take the local voices and connect them with the higher scale decision making. And that way, I know some of our colleagues at IVME, because we have 15 offices around the world. So they're using multi-stakeholder platforms, which are also one of the ways you can give voice to the local communities to express their concerns. So those would be the two answers from my side. Thanks.
Yeah, well, that's a great example, particularly how you work from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. So, Rosario?
I think apart from what it has been said, on my end, I would add a lot of patience, a lot of respect, especially for differences, for values, for perspectives. We probably need to stop talking about water rights and turn the discussion a little bit into water benefits. Water rights brings people very they get them very nervous. But when you talk about water benefits, it's something else. And the same goes, and I'm talking about, from my experience, water quality, environmental concerns are more friendly to bring people together to the table than water rights. How much water you have to have? It's not a good question to ask in Texas, for example. But if you talk about water quality, because it has more impact, socially, and it has a safety, health concern, public health concern, so it brings people together more easily. And the other one is, believe it or not, science is negotiable. Perspectives, values, culture is not negotiable. So it is easier to negotiate science than to negotiate, and we should be able to identify what exactly is the source of conflict. Is it water? Is it the science, or something that we are not able to identify? So that's the more complicated part, but is the most important part. And of course, and that helps you build trust over the long term. You have to be persistent and very resilient. I am originally from Mexico. I was born and raised and educated, actually, in Mexico. And then when I came to the US and I was working for Texas, and I knew my colleagues on the Mexico side, they were kind of confused. Who do I work for, right? Who do you represent? What are your interests? What are your values? And the easy door for me was to say, well, I work for the basin. And I truly work for the basin. So I don't know if they believe that or not. But that's the only way I can get out. So it matters at the end of who you are talking to and what do you actually represent. Yeah.
Anything on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think within the water world and maybe the larger environmental world, I think there's real recognition that there does need to be input from the public. I don't know if that's true at the kind of transboundary negotiation level. At the minimum, all you really need to figure out is what the quantity, quality, and timing is of water at the border. That's really the only thing you need to figure out. And so we had a treaty in my basin, the Columbia Basin, between the US and Canada, signed in 1960, that had figured that out quite elegantly and had figured out the benefits if they built 4 dams together and they focused on hydropower and flood control, you could grow the benefits. And it was a good treaty, except that it didn't take into account at all any of the indigenous needs in the basin. It cut off the migration of salmon to Canada and didn't take into account environmental needs at all, and didn't take into account public participation at all. So that was 1960. And then as it starts to come to some of the clauses end up ending, like now, and so we've been renegotiating a new treaty over the last 10 or 15 years. And they just last week, it was really interesting, came out with the principles of a modernized treaty that does, in fact, take into account the environment, does agrees to study the migration of fish into Canada, has an indigenous advisory board that now has a place for indigenous voices and has no clause whatsoever for public participation. So, and in contrast, and in parallel, the same week, the Nile Basin Initiative entered into law because the 6th country, South Sudan, signed on to, this is a treaty between it's for all the Nile Basin, and that has a really rich, nuanced, sophisticated public participation mechanism. So now here we are in the Pacific Northwest trying to figure out how to get these guys from the Nile to come teach our people how to manage our damn water and let them have some public participation going on, because you can't, I mean, you can't not. We know what's going on, as everybody here has said. We know what's going on the ground. We know what our values are. We know we have much more in common across the border than we do oftentimes with the rest of the country. And so doing any kind of treaty these days without some mechanism for input just is counterproductive.
That part seems to have gotten left out of the modern treaty,
Modern treaty. Yeah.
label.
No
Yeah.
people.
Excellent. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so over to you. Please make your way to a microphone if you have questions for our panel. I'm assuming we have a question on the Slido that we can start with.
Yes, we do, while people are getting set up at the in-person mic. So our first question from our online audience is, what roles or involvement have you seen non-country or non-governmental bodies like industrial polluters play in water cooperation conversations and decision-making?
Fascinating question. Who wants to tackle that one? Nobody wants to tackle it.
I'll do it. I don't care. I got tenure. So, no, I'm assuming the way the question is couched is what detriment do certain people bring, and it's true. There's because of the way structures are set up, a lot of parties can get away with doing a lot of things that they probably shouldn't be doing. Now, if the question is how do you address that, I've seen some really kind of elegant ways. There's if you have a river basin organization that has collective decision making, and there will be kind of stakeholder representatives for different bodies. I've seen a couple of basin organizations where somebody represents the river itself, which is really, really powerful, that the river has to agree to anything. And oftentimes an environmental NGO will represent the environment writ large, and polluters also have a seat at the table to be able to help figure out how do we collectively address the problem of pollution. And over, I think when that conversation happens, collaboratively, there are many, many more options than there are not. So I'll just leave it at that, unless you want to add.
Yes, I think we have to be inclusive, everyone. I mean, they're big stakeholders and we actually want them on the table. And they have to be on the table. So if we really want to make a difference or have an impact on decision making, they have to be involved. So the good and the bad together.
Yeah, there's a sort of analogous conversation, I guess, that happened at the COP meeting, right, recently, where it was, should oil states have a seat at the table in terms of negotiating climate agreements? And, I was like, of course they should. But, of course, not everybody necessarily agrees with that. All right, got a nice line brewing here. Question?
Oh, thank you. Laurie Krieger. I'm here on my own, but I'm with Queen Cities Blue Ocean, a USAID program. What I haven't heard you talk about, first of all, thank you very much. It's really informative. What I haven't heard you talk about is power differentials and corruption. I'm thinking, for example, there's a very well-studied Australian case study where a mining company upstream was number one, using a lot of the water, and number two, polluting the water for the ranchers and the farmers downstream. And they won. And they won because they had the money and the power. So, and it was across states in Australia. And I also was very surprised about the community input into, I worked on that Nile Basin in the 90s. And let me tell you, there wasn't community input. I was doing a study to find out how they would accept what they were being forced to do. So I found that very curious. But my question is, where does corruption and power differentials fit in? Thanks.
Okay. I'm going to get fired after this. I think that we need, I learned this in Spanish. Let me try to. It is what it is, right? We are not trying to, we should not be trying to change the world. As you know, corruption is everywhere. It is as good as it gets. is what we have to deal with. Those are the cards that we have to play with, for good or for bad. And we have to be realistic. We can do as good as we can. We can try. And we're always going to be there, right? We're old enough to, I guess, well, I don't know me. I'm old enough, yeah, to know what's good and what's bad. But I don't know. We can't control the world. We can't control the forces of nature, or forces of human vulnerabilities. I will leave it with that. It is what it is.
I'll just add just a bit. Obviously, in our little transboundary water world, we can't take on, global corruption, but I think within the room we can. And so I'll just tell you what I try and do. Any process that I'm facilitating, you always start with how are we going to know we've come to a good agreement, right? What are the performance criteria for a good agreement? We do that on the front end. And inevitably on that list is it has to be sustainable, it has to be just, it has to be equitable. And so whatever's happening in the room, and I've seen a lot of times where power gets equalized, where there's a hegemon maybe, but there's also counter-hegemonic kind of forces. All the non-hegemons get together and kind of gang up on the hegemon. So power in the room tends to be equalized. But at the end of the day, once they're moving towards an actual agreement, then we come back to our performance criteria and ask, is what we're doing sustainable, equitable, just? And that's the only place that I have any levers, is to help the process be thoughtful about exactly those issues. But I'm also honest enough with myself to recognize what little part that I have within that room excludes a whole bastion of things that you're talking about.
I think it's an important reminder that I think the Australian example is an interesting one of, so the laws work differently depending upon where you are in the world, and that has a big impact on what can't be done. I was in Australia during the 2000s of the big drought and seeing what was happening, not just with mining, but just large landowners buying up the water entitlements from small landowners because that was the only commodity they had left that was worth anything. And that speaks directly to this issue of power and consolidation of power. All right, let's. We have another Slido, then we'll come back to the microphone here.
Yep. Our next online question is: the World Meteorological Organization of the United Nations, which contributes to the IPCC, has 193 member countries, yet the World Water Council only has 52 member countries. Should there be a World Water Organization of the UN? Wouldn't this help confront issues facing transboundary watersheds with increasing population and the climate crisis?
Great question. That's simple, right? That's just a yes or no.
Yeah.
Right?
Bunyod, that's yours.
I think this is more Aaron's. So,
yeah, right. What I've seen, and again, only speaking for myself, there's only so much you can do at the global level for principles. And we've done them. There's some legal principles. International water use should be reasonable and equitable. It should not cause significant harm. You should notify appropriately your neighbors to what you're doing. But at some point, all water's local. It just is. And so I think there's something useful about data collection like WMO. I think, figuring out what's happening globally around the hydrologic cycle is important, and having a database of all the agreements that we do have at Oregon State University may be useful so people can tap into each other's experience. But at the end of the day, agreements get negotiated at the basin level. And if you go to any basin in the world, the first thing they'll tell you is they're unique, they're unlike any place else in the world, and what are you doing here as a foreigner? You know nothing about our situation. So, I've been told that in a lot of languages. So. So I appreciate the question, and I would put as much emphasis on those basins that don't have agreements, helping to support those basins come to agreements that have local values and local mores and local data sources, as I would maybe thinking about kind of the global values that we may want to impose worldwide. I don't know. Bunyod, help me out, man.
So just to add, I will definitely second you. So for example, World Bank was involved in, like some of the negotiations, right? But if you talk about case of Central Asia, then just like what Aaron said, they would say, foreigners. Even I work for international organizations, but sometimes when I speak, some people assume that I'm also a foreigner, but I'm from Central Asia, so then I remind, I do understand the cultural differences. I grew up, it's not like something, that I learned, like I'm from here. But I completely agree. Some parts of the world, it's just, they're not going to welcome.
All right. Back to the room. Microphone. Yes, please.
Hello, and thank you guys for being here. All your work is really exciting and very interesting. And I definitely agree with the comment that all the data that we collect won't necessarily give us the outcomes that we need. And I think a lot of people here are kind of circling around some of the same concerns regarding consequences or the lack thereof for not upholding treaties, which you talked about. They're kind of sound like optional. If the U.S. uses up all the water and doesn't let much get down into Mexico, what is the plan, or is there any consequence for that? Or what about at any level, if there's private ownership of, say, like the Ogallala aquifer? Is there any way to make a private owner share the water that supports the breadbasket? So yeah, we have to treat groundwater and surface water separately. But what about like going into crisis mode a little early, thinking about deep sea seabed drilling for aquifers in areas that no one owns? So the UN really doesn't have any way to enforce any of this. So is there kind of a firmer plan in the wings for when these water restrictions do become national security issues? I think that would be really interesting to know. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think one way of addressing that is sort of what recourse do injured parties or those that are missing out or lack control of a water resource, what recourse do they have when they feel like they've been injured due to another actor's taking some water?
Well, it depends where you're talking about. If it's Mexico, US, and it's the Mexico side that it's being affected, if they are aware, they are affected, they might not be aware. There's nothing you can do, except you can rely on, the draft articles of Transboundary Aquifers of the UN, and those principles that are that already mentioned as well. In the case of the US, or in the case of Texas, for example, so is the rule of capture. You can extract as much water as you want, regardless of the impacts to your neighbors, domestic or, of course, international. So the regulation actually protects you for not being responsible. Yeah, this was, early 19s. Things have changed. Regulation has not changed. So I think that we are seeing right now is the limits of the system as we know it, on how that, I guess, negligence from sharing parties has taken us to on a very unsustainable future, a very irresponsible future. But because precisely of that, there's nothing really that we can grab for or we can call for to protect both the resource or the users, not in terms of groundwater. Surface water is different, but groundwater in the border, it's, what is it? It's, sálvese quien pueda. You know what that means? No, nobody knows what that means. It's like, you know, a gray area. You can do whatever you want to do. But don't say that out loud.
It's a good thing they're not recording, right?
Or webcast.
All right, I think we're gonna, we have a couple minutes left, so I think we'll take, one more. Go ahead, please. You're in the room. Yep.
Well, thank you. I'm Frederick Drummond. I'm with the National Science Foundation. I just recall the many discussions about the importance of international institutions who manage water boundaries and whatnot. And while we discussed a lot of negatives, I was wondering if we could give a few examples of some really effective institutions and what factors made them effective, and if those factors could be replicated in other institutions.
Wow. All right, could we end on a
Yeah,
positive
we
note?
do that.
That's a
How
great.
how much time do we have?
Yeah.
You have 1 minute. So let's do this. Let's get a wrap up from
Yeah.
each one of you.
Yeah.
And so I think tackling that question in terms of
Wrap it up.
a good news story in terms of international institutions that were helpful and effective, and then any other key messages you want to leave the audience with. Aaron, you go first.
Thank you for the question, first of all. I think there's a lot of good news in water. I think the fact that there are 700 treaties around water resources, and they're very rarely broken. They're almost always upheld, that there hasn't been a war over water for 4,500 years, that when we interact over water, 2 out of 3 times it's cooperatively and not conflictively. I think that's really, really good news. We have rich history of dialogue. And on the specific agreements, I think, as I said before, every